Well, good morning, everyone. We're going to start the next session. It is entitled, All Disasters Are Not Created Equal. We're talking about the different recovery resources available after a disaster. This session kind of came about some conversations we've had with a lot of different folks about what happened in different disasters and what resources were at the table. And Jay mentioned this morning about the misguided and unfortunate comparison between Tuscaloosa and Joplin that was done at one point, which really brought home the point that you cannot compare disasters at all. As much as folks that have been dealing with disasters are always asked, well, how does this compare to the last disaster? You just can't do it because the federal resources are often very different that come to play on a disaster. The state resources are different. The local resources are different. The philanthropic resources are different. Volunteers are different. The people, the culture of the community, everything is so different. So it's so hard to compare the disasters, and they're not all created. It may make a difference if you have a presidential declaration where you have access to FEMA resources. It may make a difference if you have individual assistance, which is a type of FEMA program to help individual households, or if you have the public assistance program, which is to help communities rebuild public infrastructure. Some of the times they're turned on, sometimes they're not turned on, sometimes they're both turned on. So there's so many different variables. And so that's what we wanted to talk about today. Each of our guests will be talking for 5 to 7 minutes about some of their takeaways on the different disasters. And then we're going to open up for conversation. So we're going to be talking about lessons learned today. And lessons learned, as we said, we can't compare them all. Lessons learned are, I don't always like that terminology, but I look at it in terms of, they're just a springboard. And whether you want to perform a triple Lindy or a belly flop depends on how it's handled locally. And if anybody knows the reference to triple Lindy, you get some bonus points after the session. So without further ado, I will start introducing our guests. And on your all's left and my far right is Sally Hemingway. She is the Director of Business and Community Services for the Missouri Department of Economic Development. This is also sometimes referred to as the Deputy Director for the Department of Economic Development. She's had a leadership role in this state's economic development future for, quite a few years.
A few decades,
yeah. But one of the things that, I've known Sally for a while, and she's taught me a lot of lessons over those decades. But her and Governor Nixon actually taught me a great lesson after the Joplin tornado. I was used to working with communities and said, we have the community stakeholders, and then we have the community resources. And we try to work them together as much as possible, but there's a clear delineation. And she said, no, we are not, the state of Missouri is not a resource. The governor here feels that this is my town, these are my people, and we are stakeholders, and we're going to sit at the front table, and we're going to be an active part of this recovery effort. It was a great lesson, and you can see some of the benefits that Joplin received by just that simple perspective by the state. That's Sally. Next to her is Kim Newman. She is the village clerk in Nebraska, and we heard a little bit about Nebraska earlier. There wasn't her town that didn't have the working sirens. I'll let her tell that story a little bit more. She is a smaller community, so the resources she dealt with were quite a bit different than what some other communities may be useful. But she did have a Cracker Jack staff, somebody by the name of Panzer, and she can talk about that a little bit later too. Next to her is Louie Turner. I've known Louie Turner for a few years now, and her background with the American Red Cross helped me, and she continued to remind me that the human element of the disasters. She's the Federal Coordinating Officer for FEMA, and for you all who know that terminology, all those words are actually very specific. She is the person that is charged with coordinating federal resources and managing the operation locally for the disaster. It's almost like it's a whole little federal agency set up instantaneously to help communities respond and recover to disasters. So she carries a great weight in the aftermath of a disaster. We're very fortunate to have her here today. And then lastly, not least, Honorable Walt Rolltie Maddox. And I think you've heard a lot of introductions about him already, but we've crossed paths over the last few years, and it's always been very meaningful to me to see how he is carrying that message about making sure that people understand the dynamics of the recovery science and where the gaps are, and trying to bring people together in order to forge better futures for those that are impacted in future disasters. So that being said, we're going to hear a few minutes about some of their takeaways that they've had about different disasters, and then we're going to open it up to you all to ask more questions. Sally.
Sure. Thank you, Steve. I think I'm going to add on to what you said about the state's perspective in terms of our role in disaster recovery. If we come at this as a stakeholder rather than the big state of Missouri, we're from the government, we're here to serve, I think we play a better role in a community's recovery, because the reality is the state doesn't exist without its communities. We really are a function of assistance to all 941 cities, towns, and villages, and 114 counties that exist in this state. And we're an entity that is reliant upon those communities, and the success of those communities are indicative of the success of the state. And so we have to look at this in terms of not big brother, but rather a partner at the table, because in this particular case, and we'll talk about Joplin, in this particular case, the economic recovery of Joplin, the human recovery of Joplin is huge to the state of Missouri. It's an economic engine, and it just is, it's the right way to, in my opinion, to approach a state's perspective and a state's role. That said, I think you need to earn your seat at the table. You don't automatically get it. Trust is everything. And if for a state, especially for the Department of Economic Development, who has a number of resources that can come to bear, you can't overpromise. You can't promise things that you can't deliver. You have to be able to be an honest broker in what part you actually can play financially in a disaster recovery. The minute you let someone down, the minute you lose your seat at the table, and if you are not added value in, and this goes for every role that anyone plays in disaster recovery, if you are not added value, you really need to get out of the way. At the state's level, you know, the Department of Economic Development is probably categorized as a long-term community recovery agency. We're not an emergency response agency. We're not that we leave that to Highway Patrol, SEMA, and emergency response. But at the time that a disaster strikes, we start to work. We go to work assessing the level of impact to the community, but we don't just look at the level of impact to the community, we look at the level of impact to the region as a whole. And we do that in viewing at both a macro level and a micro level. And we systematically separate that into at least 4 categories. You look at the damage to housing, you look at the damage to infrastructure, you look at the damage to business, and you look at the damage to environment. And environment can include a variety of things, everything from impacts to any utilities to impacts to any parks. And our job, the way we approach it, is to organize our resources and find the gaps. We look beyond the typical response that FEMA can provide, and I'll talk in a few minutes about how knowing other programs and how they work is key to our role. But you look for those resources and organize those resources based on the level of damage or impact to housing, infrastructure, business, and the environment. Not all, as the title indicates, not all disasters are created equal. We've experienced disasters that were completely focused on housing only. The housing was the only element that where damage occurred. We've seen disasters where the business community was the only element where disaster where the impacts occurred, and the same with environment and infrastructure. It's when you recognize that, you can start to organize your resources in kind. Sometimes, like Joplin, you experience a disaster where all of those elements or all of those categories are impacted severely, and you need to really get to work to look at how you can deploy resources in a manner that makes sense. I would say that finding flexibility in your own state programs and local programs is key. You can be creative in disaster recovery in that you can look for atypical types of resources. We have lots of tax credit programs that we administer at the state level. And you'll know if you've been in disaster recovery long enough, gaps will start to appear behind the local and federal funding. And you can essentially use a lot of that creativity to look for places that you can fill those gaps with state resources. You have to understand the capacity of the community and their ability to respond. Joplin is a major city in the state of Missouri. It has an entire planning department. It has a whole community development department. In my opinion, the role of any state department of economic development is not to replace that. It's to supplement it. It's to find not only the gaps in the financing, but the gaps in the capacity of the community and help support those roles as well. A key thing that we've learned over the years is to be plugged in enough in the community to understand that there is a palatable shift in the period of time when a community stops talking about the day of the disaster and they start talking about what should happen in the future. And if you're not plugged in enough to understand that, and if you're not prepared for that in terms of being a resource partner or a stakeholder that has resources, then you're going to do a disservice to the community. Understanding, for a finance nerd like me, because this is all I do on a day-to-day basis, in non-disaster times, I help communities figure out how to finance development projects. And understanding how all of the other programs work is really key to the success of packaging any project or any plan. Typically, local planners and community members and officials can tell you the vision. They'll tell you where they want to go, and they can articulate the types of projects that would take them toward their vision and move the community toward that goal. But very few people, unless you seek them out, understand how all of the financing tools can be put together to make those projects really happen and move those toward the goal. And I think that earlier there was a mention by the mayor about how the Public Works Department is often kind of left out of the equation in terms of their knowledge and experience and their efforts. The economic development finance community, the people who make their life understanding how all of these programs fit together, really need to be pulled up and recognized and have a voice where they can help create those solutions. Just a couple more comments, and I will end my remarks. Another key to success in terms of resources is never to stop the train. Once the redevelopment, once the recovery really starts in earnest, keeping that engine stoked is essential. If you cannot make a decision, or if you're going to delay something and that train comes to a stop, it's incredibly hard to start it up again, because consumer confidence is key in economic recovery, in disaster recovery. So make those decisions. Progress is dependent upon movement, and sometimes the train may get a little bit off the track. You can always correct. You can course correct along the way, but never be a person who is part of stopping that train. So with that, I will pass it on to my colleague.
Hi. As a village clerk treasurer in a town of 352, that's what we had before the tornado, I wear 500,000 hats. I'm the local floodplain manager, I'm the zoning administrator, I'm the backup water operator, I drive the trash truck, I push snow. I also on the side, I'm also a volunteer firefighter EMT, I teach EMS, I teach fire. So what helped me a lot, or what helped the town a lot is, and I'm not saying this to give me a big pat on the back, is I was a great resource when the tornado happened. I taught NIMS classes, which is the ICS of what everybody goes by. I knew what all those gobbledygook of ABCs, everything meant for. So when NEMA, the Nebraska Emergency Management Agency, hit the ground the next morning, I knew what they were talking about. They didn't have to explain a whole lot, which helped us as a community. It was difficult a lot because I lost my home, I lost my office, I lost my fire hall, I lost my church. We lost 73 homes, we lost all of the business district, we lost all of the co-op, which in a rural community, co-op is big. All the grain bins, and it was very difficult to try to move forward from there. We did lose 2 lives. We lost a five-year-old in the middle of the town. We lost an elderly gentleman on the road right outside of the town. I do want to point out that earlier it was said that our sirens were not working. Our sirens were working. What didn't work was we have a radio control that can trigger the sirens, which a lot of people do. That did not work because the towers had already been taken down. The key had to be got out of my office and manually turned on the sirens. If you look at any or view any of the videos online, you can hear the siren until it takes it away. Then it don't work no more. My wonderful staff that I have in my office is named Panzer. Panzer is a 19.25-pound cat. When FEMA got there, they kept saying, your staff can do this. Your staff can do this. And I kept saying, well, my staff is a 19.25-pound cat named Panzer. She likes to lay on things and cover them up, but she does not type, she does not answer phones, so. But as far as my real co-workers, we have a utility superintendent. At the time, we had another full-time maintenance and we had a part-time maintenance, and that's what we had. We had the blessing of having twin tornadoes, so that got out in the media pretty fast. Only one came through town, but one was east of town. At the time of the tornado, I was actually going to, we had been called out to Stanton, which is a rural community close to us, and they had some people trapped in some houses. And I was in the back of the ambulance, headed south. My husband, who is here, he's also part of the volunteer fire department. He was driving in the front. And my middle son, who was 27 at the time, had just moved back from Lincoln. And we'd gone by the house to pick him up because we didn't have enough people because it was 4:15 in the day. He says, Mom, and pointed out the west window of the ambulance, and there I saw the big, angry, ugly-looking tornado coming toward Pilger. Stanton, was further away, and we figured that was the tornado. It was a whole different tornado than what hit us. So I was not actually in town when the tornado hit. Panzer was. She survived in what was left of my office. But when we came back in toward town and we hit the southwest corner, I knew immediately that my house was gone because I wasn't too far in from there. I was in the direct path. At that time, I had to make one of the most difficult decisions that I had to make in my life, I think. Being a volunteer firefighter EMT, you are trained to help people. I had to bypass people that were injured and get to the village office because I knew I had to be the village at that point in time. It was a choice I had to make because that's where everybody went. What do we need to do? What's next? What's next? Because of the tornado hitting rural Stanton and a few houses there, a lot of the emergency mutual aid agreements had already been enacted. They were headed towards Stanton. They were just diverted to Pilger. So we had a really good search and rescue effort going on with all of my cohorts from different departments. That went very well. I will tell you another funny story because I have so many, and I told you about this one I didn't tell you about. After I called the duty officer, who happens to sit here from NEMA, Mary, and because my chairman of the board, which is like a mayor, he had been in his basement and had a head injury. He was in the hospital. So all the area emergency managers came and got me, and they said, somebody has to declare an emergency. Where's your chairman? Well, he's in a hospital. Well, you get to do it. Okay, here's a number, call this number. Okay, I didn't know. So I call, Mary answers, and I tell her, you know, a tornado hit and everything, and she said, you know, I'll have to type up a declaration and everything, and I need letterhead and stuff. So I'm like, crap, I need letterhead. It's in my office. Well, by then, Pilger is like a square box pretty much with a little bitty thing over to the side. They had closed downtown. You know, water, sewer, gas, you know, electrical, everything was pretty screwed up, as you can imagine. And so they got a SWAT team to take me to my office. So I'm like, why do I need a SWAT team to take me to my office? Well, we get to my office, and I've, of course, been there earlier, and of course it was like, it had imploded in the front, and in the back it had smashed down, and the one place where a Panther had survived was right in the middle, which was good. But I go to my door, I pull my keys out, and I unlock the door. And the SWAT guy was laughing so hard. He said, you don't have a roof. You locked your door? Well, I always lock my door. So that was not a good story for you. You can have that. Okay. So one of the things with a smaller town when we have a disaster is you don't have a big staff to do all this. I relied a lot on NEMA the first few weeks. We had so many volunteers. We had to figure out what to do with them, and we were blessed with them. I know somebody had said there was 17 million or something with the volunteers. We had 2 million. The price, you know, calculation, which is going to help us a whole lot. We had all those volunteers. We had volunteer equipment come in. Our biggest thing then was, okay, how are we going to fuel these big equipment, this big equipment and everything? And we got some of the people to bring some tankers in and to fuel these tractors and backhoes and everything to clean everything up. Oh, people were going haywire with chainsaws. It was fun. We lost over 300 trees, and that was really sad too. But as we went along our recovery, one of the things in a very small town is you don't have a lot of contractors there. And to find people that would come in and redo roofs, redo siding and everything else, and we did have some contractors that were really bad, nasty people, you know, that got ran out of town, but that was an issue, and it continues to be an issue today. It's hard to get people to come to a small town to do that. We actually have also one of our projects is to fix some of the roads where, you know, when houses and trees and other equipment use your roads, they kind of tear them up. So one of our FEMA projects is, you know, only 12 blocks of roads. So we had to go out to bid twice to get somebody to come to do that. So you don't have a whole lot of pull when you're a very small town, but I always said before the tornado was mouthy, and I'm even more mouthy now. And I fought for Pilger along the way, and I'll continue to. Next month it'll be 2 years. Our bank is going to reopen in a month. Our convenience store, which was our only fuel and groceries and services in town, it will reopen in a couple months. My office will be open in a month. We went out to bid for our fire hall. So we're moving along. It's just, it's a slow process. And, you know, mistakes can be made along the way, and not just at my level, but higher up. And we did have a few things that we had to deal with and correct. But as long as you keep the communications open and you figure out what you need, just go out and find it. I mean, just keep pushing. If you can't, you know, if somebody won't listen to you, make them listen to you. You know, what are they going to do to you? Shoot you? They can't do that. So, thank you.
Oh, good morning. I was just listening. I could listen all day to these kinds of stories. Kim, I do have an offer for you. I have a forklift driver's license, so I can come help you.
I'll put your number later.
And I was thinking as you were talking about, you know, the FEMA people that kept saying your staff can do it, your staff can do it. Now, you understand I'm here with FEMA. And that Panzer's job was to, I think you said, lay around and cover things up.
Yes.
It is entirely possible that those FEMA people knew that. It is entirely possible. Just had to say. Is this being taped? I feel so honored. I cannot tell you to be here, to be back in Joplin. I've been here several times since the event occurred. I did have the privilege of being the federal coordinating officer that actually was already here in Missouri. We were working 2 other declarations and had 2 emergency declarations. There was weather pending. We were actually doing continuing damage assessments along the Mississippi River in counties that had not yet been declared or added to the existing declaration. And the week before, we had been on a conference call with the Army Corps of Engineers and FEMA Region 7, where we were told that the Army Corps was sandbagging along the Missouri River, and that if we received normal rainfall for that time of year over the next few weeks, that the flooding would be worse than the 1993 floods. So I worked the 1993 floods in Kansas and Missouri with the American Red Cross, actually, so I remembered what that was like. I knew that a lot of good things had been done since then, but we were kind of looking around us, and it just seemed that we were surrounded by disasters and potential for disaster. I'll also tell you that I was in a good place because FEMA Region 7 was strong and supportive and had good relationships. And when we ended that call and we went on with business, and a few days later, I was actually sitting in a hotel room in Columbia watching the aftermath of the tornado in Joplin. And that evening, right away, began conversations with the regional administrator in Region 7. Oh, I see her sitting back there. You saw her yesterday, Beth Freeman. And together, we began to put together a plan. Resources began to go toward Joplin, and the next morning we sent staff. We actually pulled together that night at the JFO. We brought in the senior staff from the operation, and folks came in, one lady in her curlers and another person in their bunny slippers, and we all gathered together and tried to figure out what we would do next. And I want to tell you that I have heard so much here just in the last day and a half about the absolute importance, and you said it so well, Sally, of the local community and the responsibility. If the local community, where the disaster literally does begin and end, is in a leadership role, then we can roll in and support and provide the kind of support that hopefully will be true support and resources that will make additional differences. When the leadership does not happen at the local level, it makes everything else difficult. When the leadership is there at the local level, it makes a huge difference, enormous impact on how successful in terms of speed, effectiveness, permanency, and certainly for recovery. There are 3 things that I think are central to what we do. I've come to this conclusion over about 25 years of this kind of work. One is that everything we do is about people. Everything. Doesn't matter if it's rebuilding schools, roads, bridges, brick and mortar. It's all about people, ultimately. It's all about communities. Everything we do. If a community doesn't rebuild, the people can't come back. If the community isn't involved in that recovery process, then it's a disparate effort that just is not effective. Everything we do is about people, communities, and ultimately recovery. So when I looked at the topic and the description of this workshop, I thought, what can I possibly add? And I went back just the other day to something that I've done a number of times, which is to look at the definition of the word. And when I looked at the definition of the word resource, after 25 years of doing this work, what I learned is that the source, the origin of the word comes from the Latin word that I can't pronounce, but it means to rise. And later from an old French word, won't try to pronounce it either, but it means relief. And literally, the origin of the word is rise again or recover. And I thought, well, is that a coincidence? That resource, that the very definition of the word has to do with rising again, with recovery, with relief. And when you look up the definition of the word, of course, it's pretty much what we think of, but it has to do with assets, which could be people, could be goods, services. I talk to our folks kind of in general terms of staff and stuff with which we deal in just big categories. But another definition of a resource is an action or a strategy that can be adopted in adverse circumstances. And certainly if you begin to broaden that definition of resource, then it can go even beyond that. And I've heard Walt and others in the last couple days talking about the spirit, the bands that we all wore, at the park that's there, the human spirit and what that brings. Sometimes in disaster operations and disaster management, we get real caught up with the stuff and the processes and the programs, and we come into a community and we layer our programs on the people and communities without an understanding of the needs of those people and communities. And if we don't understand those needs as defined by them, we will not be successful in bringing the right resources and in supporting the bringing of the right resources to bring that relief and to enable that rising again. We were able in this Joplin event to step back and to be not in the forefront, but we organized in such a way around the local leadership here that we were able to be supportive in a way that I believe was effective. Were there some things that I'd do over if we went back and did it again? Absolutely. I could identify those for you. And some have been identified for me by local leaders because we sought that out. And we actually did an after-action report that Beth supported us in doing. And we sat in September and October after the disaster and interviewed the city manager and people from the hospital system and the schools and so forth, and talked about what we could have done better. And they were very honest with us, and it informed things and helped us later. I would say this to you. You've heard it, you've said it, you know it. Enough can never be said about establishing things in advance. If we can, before a disaster ever occurs, do some broad definition of need and how we will establish systems that will bring the resources to bear to meet those needs. If we do that in advance and establish the relationships that have been talked about, then during the event, those things will begin to occur. And it enables us then to be innovative and creative, as you've said, about what other resources we might can identify and bring together. And it truly is about bringing people together so that then whatever resources can be identified can be brought to bear. The last part of that is I've begun to think of resources, quite honestly, as a result of being asked to be a part of this event in a little different way. And I was talking just this morning with Keith Stammer, and we were talking about stories and how important stories are. And suddenly it dawned on me, that's another item I'm adding to my resource list. Stories. As we were talking, I told Keith about how after the Oklahoma City bombing, I had a good friend who had 2 family members that were killed in that bombing. I worked for the Red Cross. I wanted to go and help. I was out of pocket at the time. A call came for me to go, and I was so upset that I didn't get to go. And about a year and a half later, I sat with another friend for an hour and a half with tears running down our cheeks as we listened to the guy that did go and heard his stories that he was telling, oh, by the way, for the first time in well over a year. And as he told those stories, I absorbed every word. And years later, 2 days after 9/11, I was on a team that was called to go and got there on Thursday. Saturday night, went to Ground Zero, saw what was going on, did some work there, and Sunday morning came back to our staff and said, we have got to stand up places for the rescue workers to come away, and began to describe based on the story that I had absorbed from Pete after the Oklahoma City bombing. And we established some things then that were not because Libby had a good idea, not because she was smart. My mom thought I was smart, but not because I was smart, but because of what had already occurred and the story. Those resources are critical. We set up task forces in Joplin. We operated in a way that wasn't necessarily typical so that we could bring together the locals, the state, the federal, and other resources. And whoever had play in getting the schools open on time, in getting the hospital into a temporary facility and ultimately into permanency, whoever had play in getting the fire stations rebuilt so that they could operate in their communities, oh my goodness, in getting the debris removed, whoever had play, we met in task forces every day and came together as people, regardless of what agency or organization or resource you had to bring, and we came together. That was an incredible piece of our involvement and what was meaningful to us in that. And I just want to tell you one other story. This is not widely known. We were in our facility. We were trying to help with the pets. You heard pets talked about yesterday. And I heard the people from, I won't get all the acronyms right, but APHES and the different groups that deal with pets, and they had almost 1,000 pets from the tornado that had been gathered up. They were working with shelters around the area, trying to get trucks and kennels and people to help with distributing these pets because they just couldn't keep them in place any longer. And as I listened to them talk, they said it was going to cost about $250,000 to do this. And I said, stop. Let us help you with this. We can get the word out. Do you realize there are thousands of volunteers coming into Joplin every weekend that drive here? They would love to rescue a Joplin pet from the tornado and take it home and give it a great place to live. We'll help you. We'll make flyers. You know, we've got AmeriCorps dealing with these volunteers. They'll pass them out. You could probably get these pets adopted over time. And they said, well, let us think about that. And I walked away, gave it no more thought. They ran with it. They set up a weekend of a pet adoption in Joplin. On Saturday, all of the pets that Joplin had were adopted. And they said, what are we going to do? We've got another day. They called all those shelters that they had been planning to send them to, and they brought their pets here. And by the time Sunday was over, all but 35 cats had been adopted. It was a huge success. And the gift that was given to people of pets that they were able to rescue from Joplin, where they were coming to volunteer and invest, was an incredible thing. Those kinds of stories, those kinds of resources of bringing people together and being innovative and creative just as a result of recognizing need and people coming together with resources to try to meet it. It's huge. It's an incredible thing. Add that to your list of resources. And again, thank you for allowing me to be a part of what's going on here this weekend. Thanks.
Well, good morning, and you've obviously, I've gotten a lot more time than the panelists did this morning, so you know Tuscaloosa's story, so I will be brief. Let me give you a quote that I love. It's by former Senator Moynihan from New York. He said, everyone's entitled to their opinions, but not necessarily the facts. And the reason why I give you that quote is one April morning, about a year after the tornado, I awoke to an op-ed piece that was in the Wall Street Journal that was comparing Tuscaloosa's recovery at the time to Joplin's recovery. And there were numbers that were flown in that an op-ed piece was done by a University of Alabama professor that was actually sponsored by a libertarian think tank. It was also done by someone who hadn't even visited Joplin. So it was quite the comparison story. And the numbers being off, I think in the story it quoted as Joplin being 85% built back, which no one knew. Everyone knew it wasn't right. But the fact of the matter was, it was this diatribe of get the city and its overreach of government, and Joplin's got it right and Tuscaloosa's got it wrong. And of course the story hits nationwide, and regardless of whether the facts were accurate, all of a sudden it becomes a narrative. And then we're having to take a step back and begin explaining our decisions. So I start off with that to say that recovery is not easy. And oftentimes opinions will manifest themselves as facts. And I will also use as an illustration that each recovery is different. Because even if Joplin was 85% rebuilt back at the time, which it wasn't, that was Joplin's decision. Tuscaloosa had to take a different path. And let me tell you why. I showed you earlier some of the data that we showed you. We knew that 70% of the housing was rental with a median income of less than $25,000. We also knew out of the 2,500 families that we had to find housing for, we had found housing but all for two. And they were in housing that was better than they were prior to April 27, 2011. So we didn't have a housing crisis to deal with. It also meant large swaths of land that were, many of it that was developed before the city had codes, was not going to meet any new regulatory standard. Again, we knew we had time. We also knew that 1/3 of our businesses were non-conforming, many of them uninsured. So we knew there were going to be insurance issues. We knew we had time. We also had nearly $700 million worth of infrastructure needs within the 12.5% of the city destroyed. So to think that you were going to somehow get this mass back of rebuilding when you had storm lines that crossed property lines, when you had sewer lines that crossed property lines, when you had water lines that crossed under pieces of property, all of that's going to have to be rerouted, redone. Plus, in the meantime, ALDOT and the city wanted to go ahead and take advantage of this opportunity to widen the roadway, make other infrastructure improvements. You had all these things going on, and we needed time to plan properly for growth. Yet here's this article 1 year later. And I remember sitting there thinking, and it was probably the most angriest and disappointed I'd ever been since April 27, 2011. And even myself, I got to admit, after reading that article, although I knew the facts were not correct, I even myself began to doubt, are we doing this the right way? Well, I can tell you 5 years later, absolutely. And if you come to Tuscaloosa, you'd be absolutely amazed by the transformation itself. Even today, constituents will come up to me and say, I doubted you at first, and really the city, but y'all were right. So let me give you a few quick points, and then we'll get to Q&A. Number one, you've got to have a strategy for long-term recovery. You have to have a strategy in place that's going to be long-term successful. I have many thoughts on how that should be shaped, but you need a strategy to deal with it. If you develop that strategy, I think it has to be married with data, because one of the strongest arguments we could give is to come back with data, come back with the facts. This is why we are making these decisions. Number two, the process has to be transparent. The public has to feel involved and engaged, because here's one of the really cool things about it. When that article came out, we didn't even have to respond. Our citizens responded, thousands of them. They're like, well, hell no, that's our plan. This guy's criticizing our plan. We went to these community meetings. We want these things. And so your community, all of a sudden, you had this buy-in that I don't know if I could have created myself, that this person actually did for us. And then took, again, pride in their city. I think the third thing, that it has to be focused on long-term results, and there has to be a political will to do that. And not every community is going to have that just because of the different dynamics that serve in the community. The fourth thing is, in the meantime, as you're implementing this long-term plan, you're going to have to focus on short-term successes. Getting the schools open, getting a new intersection done, celebrating the small business that comes back. Whatever it is in the psychology of recovery that has to take place. Hope is something that everyone has to have during the recovery, and the continued hope that somehow, some way, we are going to get through this. So those are just a few general points. I'm sure during the course of discussion, a lot more of this can be vetted out, and we can go into a lot more detail.
Great, thank you. Thank you all very much. We have about 15 minutes left. I have a quick question I have for our panel as far as resources. We've heard a little bit different, unusual perspective that Walt, you just talked about how a resource that you had were actually the people's ownership of the process moving forward. They gave you a lot of ability to make some decisions. Libby brought forward the perspective that stories are an actual resource, so it's an unusual perspective. So what type of surprise resources, either early in the disaster or later in the recovery, did you all experience that came to the table that you weren't necessarily expecting, either new money or some philanthropic? Somebody came to the table with something that you weren't expecting. Anybody have that happen? Let's go Sally and then Kim.
I have a couple of examples I can give. One is very simplistic and logical, but not really immediately thought of. After the Joplin tornado, literally just having the driver's license bureau from Jeff City haul down their machinery that creates a driver's license on the spot, and have those here and available. The lines were incredibly long because people's paperwork was in the next county, but it really, having that ability to regain your paper identity as quickly as possible was an incredible resource that I just, I hadn't thought of, but thankfully the Driver's License Bureau had thought of it. The other one was compiling together the GIS resources from the National Guard, from the State Office of Administration, and from the City Planning Department. Those GIS resources, this is the first time I've ever worked in a disaster recovery where we used more mapping to really identify what the issues were and how solutions were coming about than ever before. And we did things like, and I don't know if Libby's going to be mad or not, but we took the data from their input, from FEMA's input, and we mapped out all the zip codes where people were receiving their individual assistance checks, and found out immediately that 80% of the population were within 60 miles of Joplin, which gave the city leadership that confidence that they could go out and actually say that we want to maintain our population. It's very important to maintain our population, and to give the individuals confidence that not only were they thinking, I want to stay, but their neighbors and friends were also thinking, I want to stay. So just using today's technology, we didn't have available to the degree that we do now when I started in disaster recovery after the floods of '93, but it was amazing how much we could do with GIS technology in all different fronts.
What surprised me a lot was all the religious organizations that came right away. I'd never heard of some of them, but they were there with tarps, covering up roofs, and doing a lot of things. And then further on in our recovery, the Mennonite Disaster Services, they have actually put up 5 new homes in our town. And we didn't have a Mennonite church in our town, and it just really surprised me about all the religious organizations that came to help us.
And no, Sally, that doesn't make me mad at all. That's exactly what you should do. And this will sound like I'm just saying this because I'm here, but I'm not. The surprise to me, quite honestly, I didn't know anything about Joplin, but the local leadership was huge. Leadership said, this is our community, both in Joplin and Duquesne, and we take responsibility. And that happened over and over and over again. Again, all the leaders I've mentioned earlier, they took the lead. They took the responsibility. I heard Leslie Hosh yesterday talking about a program that we put into place with debris removal, and an unusual piece of it with private property debris removal. And the city took on an enormous amount of responsibility and work in order to make that happen, that if they had not done that, it would have been very difficult. That happened over and over and over again, and it continued into long-term recovery, which is where I met Jane Cage and others, and later then when some other communities had disasters and had needs, we actually reached out. I reached out at the request of FEMA Region 10 when the Oso mudslide, to people in Joplin that got on the phone with people out there and walked them through things. The amount of leadership, honest ownership, and taking a responsibility here was a surprise, and it doesn't continue to be surprising, but that was the most significant for me.
First, I want to say Operation Clean Sweep, which was authorized in Tuscaloosa and Joplin, one of the keys to recovery. When you can remove your debris, we were thinking it'd take a year. 1.5 million cubic yards. I can't imagine what Joplin's was. That's enough to fill Bryant-Denny Stadium up 5 times from the grass to the top of the lights. And it has to be segregated, air tested, everything, asbestos, and the whole gambit. FEMA doing that is one of the best decisions that absolutely helped us. It certainly was an invaluable tool. And I can't believe that FEMA shared IE information. It wouldn't share it with Tuscaloosa. So I'm going to go back and give our people hell. Thanks.
I had to sign away my firstborn child to get it.
Anyway, okay, that's another topic. Later on. Two quick surprises. Number one, just the faith-based, the number of volunteers. It took us 2 years to shut down our volunteer reception center, and we could have kept it going. I mean, at some point, we had to begin pulling back our resources. And it was an unbelievable time. And again, I'd leave an organization if I mentioned them. Unbelievable, just inspiring, to say the least. The second is National Guard. When Gary was talking earlier about communication being down, the first 500 National Guard that I worked out with the governor was via text because we couldn't talk on the phone with each other. And when they came to Tuscaloosa, they were an invaluable asset to us in creating, amplifying our search and rescue, keeping control of the community. And let me just say this, and I tell this to mayors when I do this training. Curfew is an important part of your first steps towards recovery. You have to lock down your damage zone. We call it the recovery zone. And you have to prevent lawlessness and looting. If looting and lawlessness happens, people begin to have a shaken confidence in your ability to deliver not only during the response, but in the ultimate recovery that's to come. Shut it down, take the heat, because it will serve you well moving forward. And so those are a couple of surprises for me that absolutely just really were key differences in us being able to create a great recovery.
Great, thanks. We have a question? Anybody else have a question? Just step to the microphone. Please state your name and title so we have some context of the question, and then we'll get going. It takes a second after you turn it on.
Yeah, that's fine. As Kim already said, I'm with the state of Nebraska. I was a duty officer when Kim called in. Unfortunately, from our EOC with technology, we actually watched the storm spotter car, the tornado hit the town. So we mobilized immediately, and we're very grateful for that. I had tried to get hold of her, but obviously couldn't. So when she called me, I was actually quite relieved. One thing I do want to point out, and my question goes to this, there's underlying disasters under the obvious disaster. Obviously, the disaster that Kim and Walt, you both talk about is the tornado. But you both also have alluded to the fact that you have floodplain issues as well, which was kind of a major factor in your recovery. And so that's what I'd kind of like you both to address. But before you do, I do want to point out the American National Association of Floodplain Managers has chosen Kim as the Outstanding Floodplain Manager of the Year. So while her job was everything, as she said, 5,000 hats, her job as, protecting the floodplain and protecting her people has won her national notoriety, and I just want to point that out because she is an amazing person. So I kind of know Kim's story, and Kim, tell for everybody how you dealt with the floodplain and some of your stories as well. But Walt, I'd like you to also, from especially Tuscaloosa's perspective, you had a floodplain to deal with as well, and how does that affect your recovery?
Thanks, Mary. 3/4 of Pilger is in the floodplain. The quarter of Pilger that did not get hit by the tornado, it's not in the floodplain. So, we haven't had a big boom of building in a long time, so everybody had to deal with the nice floodplain issues. In the state of Nebraska, you build 1 foot above the base flood elevation, and you're also not allowed to have basements. Where do people go in tornadoes? The basement. Where did people go in Pilger? The basement. What do you mean I can't have a basement? That's what saved my life. About got shot at scene a few times, got strangled. No, not really, but it took a lot to try to get get that information across to people, that it is for their own good and everything else. But what helped is NEMA and the Department of Natural Resources in Nebraska and FEMA, we set up several workshops that explained the floodplain issues, that explained what the base flood elevation was, why is it like that, what parts of town are in there. But it was very difficult to explain to people that had been living in a home with a basement their whole life, and probably the 2 or 3 relations before them, that it was not safe. And I take my hats off to the people that came to Pilger several times to do workshops and brought maps and explained it, and they were not really welcomed either, because of course they were the rules and regulation people too. But dealing with that was difficult, and the one thing that I wanted to do was to show everybody that your house was not going to be elevated 20 feet in the air. Our house was the first one to come back. We got a manufactured home. We put it on a crawl space, all FEMA regulated, all floodplain, you know, everything, you know, it's got the floodgates in it and everything else, so that people could actually, they had an example to go by to start with.
One of the worst sentences I hear in government is, especially from us that work in government, is they should have known that. Because here's what happened for us. You had these, hundreds of homes, hundreds of businesses that were built before the city enrolled in the National Flood Insurance sometime in the late 70s. And certainly they should have known, their grandfather, but if they lose more than 50% of their structure, then it's going to probably be impossible for them to build back. Well, these problems began to manifest themselves really early. And we didn't have a lot of creative solutions to deal with them, quite frankly. So instead of kind of going what we did afterwards, and certainly we did everything we could with our state and federal partners to provide assistance, to go back and get FEMA remapping of these areas, which in some cases takes years to be able to accomplish, to see if they maybe have been moved from the flood way to the flood plain, which gives them a little bit more flexibility. It certainly was, for those in those areas, complicated, and it was some of the worst times in my life to tell people, you will not be able to build back. So let's reverse it. One of the things that haunts me in my 6 years leading up to April 27th is we should have been more active as a city in letting people who live in floodways know the risks that are out there, even letting our businesses that are non-conforming. And over 6 years, we could have knocked on the doors of over 1,000 homes or businesses and said, you're either in a floodway or non-conforming, and this is what it will mean to you if something ever happens. Your communities can do that today. You can let people know the challenges they're facing, and it may not be a tornado, they may just have a fire. You would be surprised the difference it would make. Most people don't really know that. We can say they should have known. But small businesses, they're trying to make payroll. They're trying to survive a very stagnant economy. They're trying to deliver services at a high level. They're not sitting there thinking about the next natural disaster that's coming their way. We can do that today. And if that information may help them from an insurance side, it may help them prepare, it may help you have an easier conversation if, God forbid, something like this happens in your city. That would be my advice to you.
Thanks, everyone. Jane, we are at the, Jane tells me from the back that we have exhausted our time on this session. Thank you very much for attending, and thank you very much for